Hey everybody, it's Drew Breezy, and I just want to talk to you a minute or two about cops and how they're regimented. This is actually just food for thought about the future of your safety. Now, this isn't a woe is me, you should be worshiping the ground that all cops walk on kind of segment. The target audience is, however, the fine citizens outside of the profession and maybe even the family members of law enforcement officers. Cops, this is for you too if you want to take inventory of what has been asked of you over the last year or so. And also, if you want to know what the flavor of the day seems to be going forward. Indulge me for a minute. Have you seen the latest number on officer deaths due to ambush? Have you read up on the large amount of officer suicides over the last few years? I promise you this isn't going to be gloom and doom and everything is heavy, rather a realistic perspective and just some points for you to ponder. Cops are very routine by nature. Talk to any law enforcement administrator and they will tell you the hardest thing for a law enforcement agency to undergo is any type of organizational change. A new rule or procedure, or even moving the location of the vending machine can cause quite a bit of discussion, controversy, and sometimes even dissension. Simply put, cops are set in their ways, but it's not always a negative thing. Sometimes it's for very good reason. Think about this. Things have to be the same or they're going to be out of whack. Now, maybe you can write this off as superstition, like whether or not Steven Stamkos is gonna use black tape or white tape before a game. Maybe it's just inherent in the job. If you put on your vest, then your uniform, then your gun belt the exact same way at the exact same time, every time before you go to work, you won't forget anything. Forgetting essential equipment in the cop world could be a matter of life and death. So truth be told, I would capitalize on the regimented lifestyle and the roll calls that I led. I would teach the young patrol officers who I worked with on the midnight shift to drive through their neighborhoods and their zones on a nightly basis. If you do it consistently and remain observant, it makes it a whole lot easier to detect when something is out of place, and they may be able to react to something in your neighborhood even quicker, or possibly even prevent it before it happens. So stability and consistency are fundamental characteristics of being a good officer, or at least one that's got their head in the ballgame. But so is flexibility. There was no greater test to this notion than COVID-19. Do you think your world was turned upside down by the lockdowns? Talk to the women and men who had to work through it and handle their sequestered families just like you did. For instance, I personally work with somebody on the midnight shift who would go home at 6 in the morning only to become the curriculum facilitator, the principal, the referee, and the head of the lunchroom to her elementary-aged kids. She was their teacher all day while catching cat naps here and there, and guess where she had to be at 6 p.m.? That's right, she had to come right back to work and make all of those heavy decisions. Not to mention the internal pressures provided by the command structure of each individual law enforcement agency that were understandably trying to navigate a difficult at best situation that COVID brought. It was mostly uncharted territory, and as I hope to lay out for you, it still is uncharted territory. Getting back to the nightstick and the regimented spokes, we all had to adapt. There were no more roll calls. Instead, only daily temperature checks. Instead of sharing information as a group in one room together, they lined up like cattle in their respective patrol cars. They would pull up and get a, "Hey, how you doing?" from the supervisors, and one of us would put a thermal temperature gun to their foreheads and very uneasily pull a trigger to determine if they could even work that night. Ironically, it's the same kind of thermometer that one might use to check the doneness of cattle on a grill. If you promise to keep this a secret, I'll let you in on something about those temperature checks. I can honestly say they were done earnestly, but we didn't catch or prevent one case of COVID that I know of where I worked. The thermometer we used was calibrated by slapping it a few times, and the readings rarely reached the triple digit. We unscientifically checked the tailpipe of one of our motor unit's bikes to see if it even hit triple digits. It did, but barely. It was number one bullshit. Taking away roll calls was also taking away one of the most important sanity savers in our profession: camaraderie. Whether it was handing out awards, announcing births, or busting chops about calls gone awry, the human interaction that we use as a coping mechanism to get through some traumatic times was temporarily removed with no guesses as to when it would return. Not to mention, you take a bunch of young officers and rip their proactivity from them, you're always going to be chasing the notion that idle hands are the devil's playground. There was no more proactivity for those folks. There was only reactivity. And not only that, They were on the front lines wondering if each call was the one that was going to give them COVID, and if they would even be covered if they contracted it. Then in May, the George Floyd incident happened. They went from being first responder heroes to racist targets of rocks and bottles, largely because the mainstream media and social media experts wanted to push a narrative that his in-custody death had nothing to do with anything except for the color of his skin. Ironically, the racism part was somehow left out of Derek Chauvin's trial, not making light of any of the situation that happened. It was a tragic death. I don't believe that it was based on race, but I digress. Just as the country did. To the officers, the George Floyd incident meant even less proactivity. I'm not offering you anecdotal evidence. I'm speaking from experience. People just like me ran the midnight shift in patrol districts and made those decisions on what the officers were going to engage in and what they weren't. I had enough horse sense to know that the summer of love was not the time to be a risk taker. It definitely took its toll on the morale, and it took its toll on our officers, both young and old. I sorted out the confusion the best I could, but what I couldn't ease up on were the restrictions we had in place. Those were non-negotiable. We kept everyone safe while walking on a tightrope with no net over a pit of vipers waiting for one of us to fall. Law enforcers are rule followers. Check the rules and SOPs of any law enforcement agency, and I can guarantee that you'll be surprised at the amount of regulations that the officers are required to follow, whether they make sense or not. Also, remember this about cops. They have to testify under oath. You see, the way we see it, anybody can say anything about anyone. Cops look at that very differently. No one in the media or in the comments section of an inflammatory Instagram post on Sarah Silverman's Instagram page has to raise their right hand and affirm that they're telling the truth. Cops do. And whether you believe they're telling the truth or not, sometimes depends on which way the wind is blowing or how the media wants you to hear the story. Cops by nature are also skeptics. It's unfortunate sometimes that life treats them this way, but this is actually how they solve a lot of crimes. There's an old saying, you go into law enforcement wanting to change the world, and you leave being changed by the world. In some cases, if you're lucky enough to even get out. Violating the Constitution has grave circumstances from a career and professional standpoint in law enforcement. So with all that being said, when you tell a group of good-hearted souls that they don't have a choice in a matter, such as a vaccine, it might make them a little uneasy. It's not about conspiracies. It's not about drug companies. It's not even unfairly characterized horse dewormer. It's a matter of freedom that's held within a constitution that they had to swear to uphold. Most cops I know, myself included, don't care about your vaccination status. I do care about my choices though. And if you want to get it, I would certainly encourage you to get it. And if you don't want to get it, I understand that too. But compelling somebody to get it in order to keep their job is an ethical storm. These cops have been through enough. First responders and cops in particular are very nervous and edgy about being made to make a choice between keeping the job that allows them to risk their lives on a per shift basis so you can provide for your family, or take a needle, whether they want to or not, that at best is a constitutional challenge in the making. Cops across this land have been asked to enforce mask mandates. They've been asked to arrest parents at school board meetings for trespassing just because the school board doesn't want to hear from a parent who is not wearing a face covering. And they've been asked to inspect businesses and count heads and make sure that the percentages are right and that nobody's sitting at the bar simply because a disgruntled patron decided to provide an anonymous tip. Is that really what a law enforcement officer is supposed to be doing? Do they deserve to be thrown away like the insinuation made here by Miami Police Chief Art Acevedo?
Back to COVID, I think we're close to making everybody get shots. I'll just leave it at that. Vaccinated. We're close.
We're close.
Hey, if you don't like it, go find another job. You're putting the public at risk.
Or what about the Portland mayor, Ted Wheeler, who had this to say when the state struck down his mandate of officers being involuntarily given the vaccine just to keep their jobs? Is crime down in Portland? I haven't checked today. Can those taxpayers afford to lose even one more good officer? Just a question. I've heard from several that are still very active in the profession, and they are uneasy about being compelled to take the shot if they want to keep their job. Not necessarily about the shot itself. That's a misnomer. A lot of first responders are feeling anxious and betrayed. Some agencies are only covering time off and medical claims exclusively for the officers who have been vaccinated. Even if you think that's fair, you're smart enough to know that it's at least worthy of some debate. So here's the bottom line, and I promise you this isn't just about me, but please allow me to give a personal example. I literally left with 28 years and 11 months. Do you think it would be a little bit tidier for me to say, I did 29 years? Or even better, I lasted in that profession for 3 whole decades. But I'll be honest, the social and internal pressures ran me off. My happiness and sanity were not worth that round number or the decent amount of money I left on the table just to pursue happiness and freedom. I also promise you this, I was one of the good ones. I also helped develop other good ones, and I worked diligently to identify the bad ones, just as you should expect as a taxpayer. So if you're comfortable running me off and the full hopper of great professionals that are feeling nervous about the instability, whether or not their livelihood can be taken away by some elected official's arbitrary decision, which is based on ever-changing science, then have at it. Cops in this instance aren't asking for a hug, just leave them alone. Think about this. What is society gonna look 5 or 7 years down the road after the lion's share of the good ones were chased out, leaving the remaining good ones to manage a hiring crisis? The thin blue line was never an opaque curtain for the cops to hide behind and work dirty. Rather, it's a shield to rest their backs on while they're handling even the best people at their worst times and carrying out duties that no one should have to. That thin blue line also prevents you from seeing the things that no one should ever have to see. They are sometimes the first and oftentimes the last line of defense between law and order and sheer chaos. Be careful of who you choose to run off. Your safety could be at stake. I'm Drew Breezy, and I'm entitled to my opinion.